Yharnam was unlike any world I had ever experienced up until playing Bloodborne. It seemed creepy enough on the outside, but I hadn't realized I had only begun to scratch the surface of just how tragic and unforgiving the plague of Yharnam really was. Maybe it was just the fact that this game was released hot off the heels of Kojima's PT in the fall of 2014, but my fascination for Lovecraftian and eldritch horror sort of peaked around the time Bloodborne was released. Everything from the plague to the people it affects gives Yharnam this really brooding atmosphere, and I absolutely fell in love with it. So, in honor of some of the scarier facets of the game that made me shit my pants my first time through, here are my picks for the 15 creepiest Bloodborne NPCs. Let's get started. I should probably begin this point with a preamble that I don't really find Eileen that creepy or off-putting as the story continues, and if anything, you guys help each other out quite a bit if you end up following her questline. But what always stood out to me is her purpose of being a hunter. Eileen, the proclaimed hunter of hunters, has tasked herself with the dirty responsibility of taking out her fellow hunter colleagues if they ever happen to fall victim to the scourge. And if you follow Eileen's questline, you'll have a front row seat to some of the plague's most heartbreaking consequences. You will see hunters slowly losing their sense of self and becoming kin to the very beasts they've hunted in Yharnam. Hunters like Gascoigne and Henrik, both of which have to be cut down in their hideous state to avoid hunting their former ranks. Eileen, as well as other hunters of their former kin, seem to dress as crows, and there's a bit of significance to this. The sky burial is a Tibetan ritual practiced by monks that suggests when one is laid to rest on a high peak, their body will be eaten by crows, and therefore returned naturally to the ecosystem. Former hunters are also given sky burials because hunters like Eileen believe it's their way of returning them to the sky, and thus to the hunter's dream. It's kind of a creepy backstory, but one that's more melancholic than anything else. Provost Willem was the founder of Bloodborne's infamous Byrgenwerth College, a research building where the Healing Church and the workshop hunters would eventually stem from. The Byrgenwerth institution and its scholars would be held responsible for their trespassings in a fishing hamlet, where they ran horrible and abusive experiments on the villagers that inhabited the hamlet and ultimately yielded the summoning of the Great Ones. And at the helm of it all were two professors of Byrgenwerth, Lawrence and Master Willem. You probably remember him appearing in a cutscene after defeating Vicar Emilia, where he admonishes Lawrence to fear the old blood, so as to warn him to not underestimate the spreading of the scourge, for the Healing Church still knew next to nothing about it. We actually see Willem as a non-player character when heading through Byrgenwerth. Willem is seen overlooking the lake behind the college, and it definitely looks like he's nearing his final days, if not already in them. Willem can barely muster the energy to even point you towards the lake, let alone speak to you, and I think that's what's creepy about him. You've heard so many stories about him and what his discoveries led to in the grand scheme, and I guess I never expected to just casually run into Master Willem lying on his deathbed, more or less. Ludwig, the Holy Blade, the first boss of Bloodborne's Old Hunters DLC, has been widely regarded as one of Soulsborne's most difficult and also most exciting boss encounters. He has also had probably one of Soulsborne's more tragic storylines. Ludwig, the Holy Blade, was among the church's first hunters that would open the door for the Healing Church to become the institution that it is. On top of being a character with the deepest roots in the church, he's also a very unique boss, with some very unique exchanges at the end of the fight. Once you, quote, kill Ludwig, you will be able to speak with his severed head. And that's almost weird hearing myself say that sentence, but let's not forget this is a game where blood transfusions can heal apparently pretty much anything you want it to. So is talking to a severed head really that out of the ordinary? But directly after the Ludwig boss fight, and upon entering the research hall area of the Old Hunters DLC, you will probably be interrupted by a mysterious bit of dialogue that doesn't seem to be coming from anywhere at first. I'm gonna be honest, the first time I heard this, I legitimately thought my character was finally succumbing to the blood and just becoming insane. And had I been just a little more observant, I would have caught the cell directly behind me coming in, and I would have found an NPC named Yamamura, a hunter from a distant foreign land. His attire and weapon of choice, the Chikage, don't seem to even slightly resemble the standard hunter's attire of Yharnam. And as it turns out, Yharnam's insanity was too much for the poor guy. We find Yamamura in his cell in a pretty unfortunate state. Alfred, the hunter of vile bloods, doesn't really come off as creepy, and upon first glance, Alfred actually seems to be one of the few sane personalities inhabiting Yharnam at the moment. Alfred gives you some valuable resources upon agreeing to cooperate with him. However, furthering his questline, all the way to giving him the unopened summons to Cainhurst, is when he begins acting a tad off. His enthusiasm for finally being given a passage to Cainhurst Castle allows him to access the Vile Blood Queen's chamber, and from there, the murder of the Queen sends him into a frenzied monologue about his adoration for Ligarius, the head of the executioners. It isn't really something we would have expected from his character, and it can be seen as pretty off-putting, seeing an NPC painted up to be orderly and well-mannered almost lose his composure over this adrenaline high he receives from murdering the queen. The fish priest NPC was once a priest of the village behind him that now lay damaged and downtrodden. He isn't hostile at all, he just walks around murmuring a prayer to the Great Ones. The fish priest appears to be one of the few villagers that survived the raids and murderings brought on by the Bergenworth College. Listening to this prayer, you can kind of assume all the tragedies that befell the hamlet, as most of their people were either tortured, abused, or just flat out killed as a result of Bergenworth's experiments. As the corpse of Cause washed up to the shore, the villagers prayed to it and were transformed into these fish-like creatures. He doesn't even acknowledge your presence, he just continues walking straight forward. I actually followed him a little bit to see just how far he would go, and part of me felt like he would have continued on and walked into the lake, but he didn't seem interested. He just turned back around and kept chanting. The doll, in addition to the fact that she's a doll, has always unsettled me a bit, largely due to her tendency to reposition around the hunter's dream when you return. Sometimes she'll be in her same position, but drifting off into sleep, and other times you may find her at the hunter's nightmare headstone. It was basically my first flag that told me there was more to this game than I thought there was. None of her behaviors seemed as though they were just done on accident. Everything she does is extremely deliberate. After finding out the doll's design was actually modeled after Maria, one of Gehrman's apprentices, the backstory of Gehrman and the doll all sort of started to make sense. There's just so much information and depth to be unpacked from this character, and to think that I once thought of this NPC as nothing more than a hub for upgrading your hunter. Sure shows me, right? Adella the Nun can be found in the Hypogean jail area, which is essentially Yahar Ghul before the Blood Moon phase after killing Rom. Adella can be found and even rescued if you approach her while wearing the church garb. Adella can be sent back to one of the safe places you found throughout Yharnam, and I highly suggest you send her to the chapel, because you will want to see just how creepy her questline can get. If you save Adella the Nun and send her to the chapel, you can actually accept blood ministration from her, and she'll give you some vials of her blood and help you out. There is actually 2 people you can do this with, and the second person is Ariana, a prostitute you rescue in the streets of the Cathedral Ward just left of the Hunter's Gate. If you accept Ariana's blood and Adella sees it, there's a high likelihood that you'll come back and Adella has murdered Ariana out of jealousy that you accepted Ariana's help over hers. I've been told the magic number is 3 times, but every time I accept blood and try to trigger the murder, it just seems to be completely random. But the most amount of blood anyone has been able to get out of Ariana before being killed is 3. so accept at your own risk. Or I guess, her risk, rather. Gilbert is an NPC that's really easy to miss in Central Yharnam. He's actually one of the first NPCs you can run into. He lives in this little building here, directly in front of the Central Yharnam lamp. It's pretty easy to observe that Gilbert has succumbed to illness, but it doesn't really sound like he's fallen victim to the scourge. There doesn't appear to be anything special about his condition. It's only the byproduct of Gilbert's old and weakened age. He even tells you that, although he knows he's going to die soon, he's grateful that he can have the privilege of dying human in a city like Yharnam, where such an event seems highly unlikely due to the thickness of the scourge. You can return to him as you progress through the main quest, and his dialogue will change, slowly divulging more and more about him as you go. Eventually, he becomes extremely distraught after speaking to him around halfway through the game, and if you care enough to revisit him this far into the main quest, he likely will have already transformed into a beast. Turns out the scourge did get to him, after all. Maybe not one of the creepiest NPCs, but I would say far and away one of the most depressing. The Afflicted Beggar is an NPC you meet in the Forbidden Woods, and he's pretty well hidden, so you might need to do a bit of exploring to find him. The Afflicted Beggar is already into some rather shady shenanigans when you approach him. There are multiple carcasses that surround him, all of which look extremely fresh, as though they had only been killed moments ago. This beggar is one of the few NPCs you can actually send to one of the two safe places in Yharnam, and depending on where you send him, you can accidentally end up killing a lot of people. If you send him to the chapel, he'll end up going berserk and killing every other person you've sent there thus far, so yeah, don't do that. Sending him to Iosefka's will give him the same fate as the rest of her subjects, and he'll be turned into another blue celestial creature from which you can obtain the Beast Rune. But if you decide to attack him directly, something else will happen. And now heading into top 5 territory of Bloodborne's creepiest, most threatening, and just in general, scariest NPCs. Greydor, the Beast-Hide Assassin, is a character you find in the Old Hunters DLC, as early as the underground cells, right after your fight with Ludwig. Greydor was one of the early church assassins that watched his former comrades become transformed into beasts themselves, and after putting them to rest, Greydor now wears their skin and other remains as a hunter's attire. You can't really do much interacting with him here in this cell of his, but the real tension between you and this NPC will begin in the fishing hamlet after you've approached Simon. Simon describes a figure who calls himself the Beast-Hide Assassin, and he has pursued Simon relentlessly in the hamlet. And if you continue on without unlocking his cell with the key Simon gave you, he will begin hunting you as well. Greydor uses an extremely peculiar weapon called the Bloodletter, a blood-tinged weapon with a terrifying transformation that can only be unleashed when in contact with a hunter's blood from the inner reaches of their body. If you decide to travel back up to his cell upon being given the key, Greydor will invade you just outside here as well. I probably couldn't get through this list without mentioning Patches in one of my top 5 spots at the very least. Patches is a recurring character in the Soulsborne universe that seems to get his entertainment from constantly pestering your character. He's the NPC that gives you the Tonsil Stone and tricks you into accessing the lecture building, one of the in-game areas extremely early into the game. As early as post-Vicar Amelia, in fact. Patches has this tendency to be sort of everywhere, which I think is why Patches as an NPC just strikes me as really creepy. If you hadn't spoke to Gilbert before you killed Amelia, for instance, you will find him in that room instead. And going through the game multiple times and realizing he can appear pretty much anywhere behind a closed door is kind of unsettling, and it makes it really apparent just how out of his way Patches is going to try and find you. Not to mention sneaking up on him after accessing the lecture building's 2nd floor and rounding through the building that way can give you a bit of a fright, just because, I don't know, I didn't really expect him to be a spider. And during my first run, this was the first time I had ever seen patches up close, so it kinda threw me, to say the least. The Enlarged Heads of the Research Hall are the byproduct of some of the older, less efficient practices of the Healing Church. Their dialogue interactions range from hearing small droplets of water all the way to thinking themselves to be a robin, and growing up to be an egg. I would put Adeline here as my third creepiest NPC as well, just because after furthering her questline and giving her the brain fluid she wants from you, and again, not kidding, Adeline will turn into one of these large and malformed heads. And this is just scary to me, because all this time you've only been told about the original experiments of which the Healing Church was responsible. You've only heard news of it through another hunter or another NPC that was alive back then and are still able to tell those stories. Only now, instead of merely hearing about them, you get to discover them yourself and see firsthand some of the more dire consequences of early blood ministration. The research hall is an extremely demented place, and had it not been for the many enlarged heads wandering aimlessly around the clinic, I don't think it would have nearly been as scary. Iosefka is the very first NPC you're likely going to be exchanging with. After being sent on your way after a successful blood transfusion from one of Yharnam's blood doctors, Iosefka insists that you go out and spread the news that Iosefka's clinic is a safe haven where denizens of Yharnam can be expected to be cared for and possibly even cured. The only thing is, that isn't Iosefka you're talking to, at least not anymore. Going into the Forbidden Woods and discovering a shortcut through the underground area of Yharnam, you'll be able to access the back door of the clinic where you discover the truth behind Iosefka's whereabouts, as well as the intentions of her imposter. On the rightmost corridor of the clinic, you'll find a blue celestial that drops an item called Iosefka's blood vial, and this sort of insinuates that Iosefka has been killed and transformed into this creature by the imposter that you later find up the clinic stairs. But visit the clinic after the Blood Moon phase, and another interaction will take place. Iosefka's imposter is now seen hunched over helplessly on a medical bed, and it seems like whatever has happened in the Blood Moon ritual is affecting her in some way. But all of the scary interactions I had with the scope of colorful characters in Bloodborne, nothing could have prepared me for the short and concise, albeit downright mortifying questline of Gascoigne's daughter, a small girl you find in central Yharnam at the start of the game. It's kind of easy to miss her if you aren't really looking for her, but I think most people found her during their first playthrough. She'll tell you that her mother has gone missing while searching for her father during the hunt, and that her family used to play a tune from this strange music box to help ease his memory. This father figure of hers, as you discover later on, is actually Gascoigne. This red brooch is something we find from a female carcass in Gascoigne's arena. Upon delivering this to the girl, as well as the unfortunate news that not only has her father transformed, but her mother has also been killed, she doesn't believe you and runs off to find them herself. After killing Rom, you can return here during the Blood Moon phase of the game and speak with another girl through the window, her big sister. She tells you that she can be identified with the white ribbon she wears in her hair, and this is where things get a little grisly. Killing the man-eater boar under the Yharnam sewers below the bridge leading you to Gascoigne will drop an item. Only in addition to a few blood vials, there's something else. It's the white ribbon the girl's sister had told us to look for, only it's soaked in a thick and pungent blood from the organs of some unfortunate victim. From this, we can assume the boar likely ate and killed Gascoigne's daughter. Upon bringing the ribbon back to her sister, she is immediately distraught and seems to blame herself for not being able to look after her during such a dark time. After visiting the Hunter's Dream and reloading the area one last time, you will find a corpse below the Gascoigne residence that wasn't there before. Turns out, after being unable to deal with her family's death, the one remaining Gascoigne jumped from her balcony window and to her death. Bloodborne excels in creating this atmosphere of depression and helplessness against the powers that be, And this little questline here in Central Yharnam, I believe sets the tone perfectly for the rest of the game. However, of all of Bloodborne's personalities, there are certainly more than just 15 of them, if I'm being honest. So if you think I missed one, or at least should have paid lip service to a specific NPC you didn't see listed here, then go ahead and feel free to let me know, and chances are I will probably agree with you. Thanks for tuning into The Forge. I'm Rusty, and I will see you next time. Take care.